win the nomination. Joining us now, Maura Gillespie, who served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Basil Smikle, the Democratic strategist and former Executive Director of the New York State Democratic Party. Also at the table, Ron Brownstein, CNN political analyst and senior editor at The Atlantic. Ron, you do such a great job of reminding us how history informs us going forward.
Yeah.
So we just mentioned how important Vander Plaats has been in the Iowa caucuses, but none of those folks went on to win the nomination. What is his endorsement mean after, by the way, the governor of Iowa also getting behind DeSantis?
Yeah, Vander Plaats is going to be useful for Ron DeSantis in Iowa without question. But there is a very clear pattern in those last three races that you note. Mike Huckabee in 08, Santorum in 12, Cruz in 16. They all won Iowa basically with the same strategy that DeSantis is following of really burrowing in, visiting all 99 counties, the full Grassley, and focusing on consolidating support from evangelical Christians. The problem is once they were defined that way, once they were painted into that corner, essentially they had a lot of trouble reaching out to voters beyond that group. They all immediately cratered in New Hampshire. None of them won even 12% of the vote. DeSantis looks like he's on that same road where he's polling in single digits in New Hampshire. And he faces, unless he can broaden, do better than them at broadening his appeal, he faces the exact same risk that Nikki Haley is positioned in New Hampshire and South Carolina to eclipse him as the principal alternative to Trump, whatever happens in Iowa. And there's an opportunity cost, real quick. Those, the Iowa Republican leadership does not want Trump, but they have chosen to put their chips on DeSantis despite all the problems that he's faced as a candidate and kind of lost the opportunity perhaps to boost someone else, particularly Haley.
It's interesting, too, because Vander Plaats also said if President Trump wins Iowa, I think it's going to be awfully hard to make the case that you can beat President Trump. So there's that as well. He's recognizing he wants this to work. Hasn't worked, as Poppy pointed out, those last few times, and yet he's all in.
And it makes sense, though, right? Especially on the topic of abortion, they're looking at it from that angle. And as you mentioned, the evangelical poll there in Iowa. So being able to reach across for a general election is pretty near impossible for Republicans if they're going that angle. And we're seeing that play out as far as the country goes. The rest of the country is not where that portion of the Republican Party is. And until they get a handle on how to talk about it, not from a moral standpoint, but what is the federal government's role, they're going to continue to lose.
Can we turn to this reporting by CNN's K-File that talks about what Speaker Mike Johnson, now Speaker of the House, has said about the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Dobbs last year overturning Roe versus Wade, and talking specifically about part of Clarence Thomas's concurrence where he talked about sort of the broader issue of rights in this country, Basil, specifically substantive due process rights, and how the court had grounded Roe and where this court said, no, you don't have that right. Let's listen.
There's been some really bad law made. They've made a mess of our jurisprudence in this country for the last, several decades. And maybe some of that needs to be cleaned up. And what Justice Thomas is calling for is not radical. In fact, it's the opposite of that.
Well, let me read what Thomas actually wrote, because many people would see it as radical and life-changing for millions and millions of Americans. Quote, this was in his Dobbs concurrence. For that reason, in future cases, we, meaning the court, should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell. And those are key decisions when it comes to contraception and same-sex marriage in this country.
No, to me, it's very scary stuff. It harkens back to some of his interpretation, that is, the speaker's interpretation of some of this goes back to some of the original thinking in this country, which is incredibly scary. But what he's done bringing it forward is criminalize doctors, criminalize women. And when you tie it to some of the conversation that we just had in terms of being able to stretch across to Democrats in a general election, there are many Republicans that are trying to find a way to be better general election candidates. When you have someone like the speaker with these kinds of comments, and the fact that if not the leadership, but the grassroots Republicans are sticking with Donald Trump, there seems to be this larger inability to be able to shed a lot of this rhetoric and a lot of these policies.
I just want to be clear, just so people know, that was Johnson right after the Dobbs decision. That was June of 22, just to be clear.
It's naive to believe that those kind of views would not eventually find some expression in policy if Republicans have unified control in Washington and the ability to do it. What we've seen since 2020 is this extraordinary rollback of rights in red states on voting rights, abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, book bans. There are proposals from Republicans in the House or Senate to nationalize all of those red state initiatives, to basically impose those red state laws on blue states. The Speaker has sponsored some of them on a national Don't Say Gay law, national personhood law. With the ability to do this, if they have the ability to do this, you will see, at least on some of those fronts, him, I believe, leading an effort to impose on blue states the rights rollback that is unfolded in red states.
We should point out Johnson's office told CNN he views the cases as settled law. But to your point, it's clear that he disagrees with a lot of these decisions. What else stood out to me that the K-file uncovered is in an interview in 2008, he said of the ACLU, and I'm quoting, "They have convinced an entire generation of Americans that there is this," his words, "so-called separation of church and state," which speaks to the point that you were making earlier about where the country may be and where Johnson and those he is with and their thinking, where they are.
So as a conservative, I'll just put this very plainly. I am a conservative because I believe in a smaller, more accountable government. And what this faction of the Republican Party has been doing is saying that half the population doesn't have medical freedom. That's big government. They're not following the conservative values that I signed up for when I became a Republican. So I haven't changed. The Republican Party is changing. And I really think they need to be called out for the hypocrisy there, the contradictions they're kind of putting forth by imposing their will on the people.
The real question is, where's the court on this one? I mean, that's going to determine everything. Thank you guys very much. We appreciate it.